Let's pretend that this little swatch is the top part of a sweater and that right now the pattern tells us to shape the shoulders by binding off 2 stitches at each side of the project 3 times. Even though some patterns tell us to bind off stitches at each side of the project, usually the shaping happens by binding off stitches at the beginning of each row, because it is impossible to bind off stitches at the end of the row without leaving one live stitch. When we bind off the first set of stitches, in our case it's 2 stitches, we do it the usual way. We work 2 stitches, knit them or work them in pattern, then pass 1 stitch over the other to bind off 1 stitch, and then knit the next stitch or work it in a stitch pattern of your choice and pass the other stitch to bind off 2 stitches in our case. But your pattern instructions will probably be different, so bind off as many stitches as the pattern tells you to bind off. And then we simply work to the end of the row using the main pattern of the project. When we get to the end of the row, we don't do anything unusual, we simply turn the work and then bind off the next set of stitches, the other 2 stitches in our case that we need to bind off. And we can do it by knitting stitches, but it is much better to bind them off in pattern. And because this swatch is worked in stockinette stitch, I'm gonna purl stitches before I bind them off. So I purl 2 stitches, pass 1 over the other to bind off 1 stitch, and then I purl 1 more stitch and bind off the second stitch. But again, your pattern instructions will probably be different, so follow the number of stitches that your pattern tells you to bind off. And then we work to the end of the row, but this time we're gonna stop when we get to the last stitch, because we know that in the next row we're gonna bind off stitches again, and that's what will do the trick that makes all the difference. But until then, we work all stitches to the last stitch of the row. And I stop right here when I have 1 stitch sitting on my left needle. I don't do anything to this stitch, I simply turn the work just the way it is, with 2 needles and 1 stitch still sitting on this almost empty needle. I bring the yarn to the back of the work because it's gonna be a knit side for me, and now we need to bind off 2 more stitches. That's gonna be the second set of stitches that we are binding off at this side of the project. And before we bind off a stitch, we are not gonna work this first stitch from the tip of the left needle. We simply slip it purlwise by inserting the tip of the right needle into that stitch from right to left. See, I'm not knitting it, I'm not doing anything to it, I simply slip it. And then I pass this unworked stitch over the just slip stitch to bind it off, like this. So we just bound off 1 stitch, but we need to bind off 2 stitches in this case, and you will probably need to bind off more stitches. And from now on we do it the usual way. We work 1 stitch and then we pass 1 stitch over the other. And right away you can tell that this little trick turned the edge from a step-like look that we usually get when we bind off stitches at the beginning of each row to a nice smooth line that is decorated with an uninterrupted chain of stitches. That's a huge improvement, right? Let's do it again. So this time we're gonna do it at this side of the work, and this little trick works exactly the same on either side of the work. So what we do, we work to the last stitch of the row. Then we turn the work as is without doing anything special to this last stitch. We slip the first stitch of this row purlwise from the left needle to the right needle, again without doing anything at all to that stitch. And then we pass the unworked stitch over the just slip stitch. That's 1 stitch bound off. And then I'm gonna purl the next stitch to bind off the second stitch that I need to bind off from this edge of the project. And we keep going, repeating the same thing. We work to the last stitch of the row, turn the work, slip one stitch purlwise, pass the unworked stitch over the just slipped one, and bind off one or more stitches depending on what the pattern tells you to do. And then we will do it one more time, working to the last stitch of the row, turning the work, slipping one stitch purlwise, then passing the unworked stitch over the stitch that we've just slipped and binding off as many stitches as the pattern tells you to bind off in this part of shaping. And that would be it. Once we finish this row, we'll see that the shoulder edges, the lines that we've just formed, look like beautiful, neat lines without any steps, without any holes, nothing at all. Look, it's just perfect. Much, much better than the lines we get when we follow the pattern instructions as written, by binding off stitches, then turning the work, and then binding them off again. See those steps? And the improvement is not just in the look of the edge. The biggest benefit we get from this edge is that when it's time to seam those edges, the shoulder seams, these edges are much easier to seam, and the seam is much neater than the seam we form when we shape the shoulders this way. So this is a much, much better option. If you find this tutorial helpful, please subscribe to my channel and click the bell icon to be notified every time I publish a new video. Happy knitting, my friend. I'll talk to you in the next tutorial.